we would give you an assignment and said, buy this really expensive book, read it, and then write a paper about it. And it's a kind of a giving yourself an assignment. And then I found myself a little bit worried whether to have anything to say once I did that, because I didn't have a thesis going in. And we've all shown that there's a ton here, and we've all taken it in our own sort of directions. And I'm excited that the volume that we'll hope to produce out of this will be really what I'd hoped it would be, which is a jump start to the scholarly community's engagement with the critical edition. It will make people want to continue to look into the materials here. So thank you for that. I think this is achieving it really well. We're hoping if you will contribute to that volume, we're looking at due dates for really nicely refined papers by this summer. Let's just make up a date of July 15th. I'll write all this up in an email, or Joe will.
Well, how long?
Anthology length, 25 pages. We've got some flexibility. We've done some invitations of other philosophers that couldn't be here, who I think whose contributions would be really important. Ronnie DeSmet, I'm hoping will engage with the math and the science even more. Gary Herstein, the same way. I want some people who are trained in terms of the math and the physics to really engage that part of it. I'm hoping that Nancy Frankenberry will want to contribute as well, and then Nick Griffin at McMaster, I'm hoping maybe will be interested in looking at the Russell stuff, although when I wrote to him, he said he was more interested in maybe looking at Einstein and Whitehead as it is here. So the volume has a really nice shape.
And Maria Teresa.
And Maria Teresa, who couldn't come, that's right. Thank you for that reminder. Maria Teresa, who is the translator of Process of Relative to Portuguese.
And the organizer of the last
Azores conference, that's right. Yeah, so I'm hoping she'll contribute as well. Thank you for that reminder. Yeah, so we invited her too. We tried.
It wasn't an accusation.
No, it just means that we take it seriously, and we tried. I wanted to also give a chance to Helmut to make an announcement about a summer school that's coming up while we're all here, because some of the people here might be interested in it. So Helmut, did you want to share?
Some of you might know already that about 6 years ago, we started, actually in Poland, the Polish Metaphysical Society started this nice tradition, which I really liked as well, of having a summer school for a week. That means philosophizing and living together for a week, which was pretty successful. The first one was in Katowice in Poland, organized by Bogdan Obodnik. And then the second one was in Germany, Duisburg-Mülheim, which was funded by the Hawking Carroll Fund. And we sent you a copy of, which finally came from out of that as well, because we started at the same time the European Studies of Process Thought. 4 volumes are out, if you look at it, Google it or whatever. And 3 are almost being in print, as far as I can figure. If you want to check that, it's the European Society of Process Thought, ESPTeu, to make it clear that it's a European undertaking, and not just Germany. And now, finally, the 5th one will be in the Czech Republic, in Budweis. Some people ask me where Budweis is. Well, it's the place where the actual Budweiser beer comes from. And I can,
it's your fault.
I can assure you that it has a very different taste to what you get here. Really different.
Has a taste. Yeah.
Sometimes clarifications help in that. 3 Czech colleagues, one particularly whom we were familiar with, they were trying to apply for a project on aesthetics for quite some time. And last year, when I was going to write Martin Kaplitzky, that we couldn't do something together, he told me, well, we got some support from the Czech sciences, and they accepted their project, because Charles University has given, which is rare these days, a chair in aesthetics itself. And so we are going together to have a project on aesthetics. We will be publishing some as well. plus we'll have this summer school. So the summer school will take place in Budweis on the campus there, South Bohemian University as it is called. It can't be done, or it doesn't really make sense to do it in Prague because, first of all, there are too many tourists around these days. It means it's very expensive, plus you won't have this kind of campus housing where everybody is really living together with the others.
Mm.
So of course we'll outside the official program have an excursion to Prague, but normally it's from Monday to Friday. Just making be certain about the 6th to the 10th of August, if I'm right, Monday to Friday in Budweis, and then Saturday we will make it an excursion to Prague, and on Wednesday there's a famous medieval town nearby Budweis where we do half a day or a tour.
Is this on the ESPT website?
It will be on the ESPT website soon.
Okay.
I just communicated with Martin. The framework is normally you have 5 invited speakers and then 15 to 20 participants via call for papers, which we'll do as well, and that will appear on the web page of the European Society. So if you are somebody who you know who is interested in aesthetics, please feel free to check and maybe apply as well. And we'll have a jam session too, because Martin is doing music, Alyosha too, and me too. So there are several people who at some point, or maybe even twice, play some, so practice aesthetics as well, just reflect on it.
We'll start singing once we're drunk.
When the details are up, can you make sure to email me so we can send it out from the Center for Process
we put
Studies?
it up on the webpage, we send it via our email stuff to European members, and of course we'll send it to you as well so that you can spread the message as well.
You can also just write me an email so I can get you into the newsletter from the European Society for
I think
Process
that might be,
Yeah.
but I'll double check.
So you would get it automatically, but we make sure that you get that.
Andrew, did you have any announcements from the center that you'd like to share in this context for this group? Anything in particular?
Oh, that's a good, well, so if there are any upcoming activities, new publications, anything that you're working on, we'd like to share it and promote it because we're the worldwide process community. And so that's one of the functions that our Center for Process Studies tries to serve. So you can either send me an email directly or go to our website, ctrforprocess.org, and use the contact function on there. But yeah, I'm really impressed by all the work that's been happening this week.
One request that I have is that if you are associated with an academic library, if you can do your best to ask the librarian to purchase the edition
Nice.
and to subscribe to the edition, because it is the case that although Edinburgh has agreed to publish the edition, it's the case that they also contract each volume separately, and if it doesn't do well enough, they won't be able to continue it, at least potentially. As long as the sales are decent enough, I guess. I don't know what the projections are, and it's too early for them to say. But Lena McHenry did say last night that Edinburgh is saying we'll see how it works. We'll see how it works out. So please do buy it, but also encourage your library to subscribe. And Christmas is coming up and Easter. But I apologize for the expense. I have to assume they put a ton of effort. The contracted labor must have been quite an expensive thing. But the layout of this, the images have to be in exactly the right location relative to the text. I mean, that takes an extraordinary amount of work on their part. And they did, I think, a competent job of that. And so before I move to Stan, who wanted to make a comment, I also wanted to repeat something that Paul just mentioned to me during the break. I'll prompt the presenters here later by email to do this, but I want to invite all of you, as you interact with the text, to share with me, and I'll share with the group, just heading at gonzaga.edu, how you find working with the volume. How it's laid out, how it's noted, how so this is an ongoing project and effort, and so we're doing our best with this first one, but there's still no reason why we couldn't improve if there are lessons to be learned. So take this as an open invitation to send constructive feedback for how you find working with the text and how it might be improved further. Stan, did you want to say a couple things?
First let me just say that I did borrow this from our library, so it is,
Yay!
and I'm going to be sure that they get all the volumes as they come, so that'll be great.
Excellent.
The comment that I wanted to make is that I came to this meeting, I've been familiar, I should say I taught 14 years in Claremont, in the Claremont colleges before I went to Berkeley. But the thing that I would very much like to do is connect with everybody, because my goal is how to bring Whiteheadian thought and process thought in general to a much larger community, which is my community, which is the science-y kind of community. And
specifically, Stan, what part of the science-y community, what kind of science?
Well, my PhD was in theoretical particle physics,
okay.
But I switched to neuroscience about 30 years ago because it became too complicated. So that's what I do now.
Okay, yeah, I was just curious of context. Science,
no, it's the general. So I loved meeting you, and I was often very offended by feeling that the language, and we've had some discussion, the language that's used is contrary to what my colleagues would appreciate. But Whitehead was really fully compatible when you dig into it. But how to do that is what I want help on. And so if anybody is interested in my little mission or big mission, I'm going to China for about a month. I'm on sabbatical next semester. And I'm wanting to spend some of the time on advertising Whitehead and to the science. They're not. Right. That's not presently being done. Right. And so my email is sklein, sklein @berkeley.edu. And so if anybody is interested in helping me do this translation, I'd tremendously appreciate it.
Ronnie Desmet would be somebody to connect with, and is the first person to occur to me that's done a lot of historical work on the connection between Whitehead and important figures in the history of science. A lot of work on Einstein in particular.
Who is that?
His name is Ronnie Desmet. And if you email me, I can get you his email address. But that'd be one of the first people. Tim Eastman. No, Eastman.
I have.
Keaton.
You know him.
If anybody's interested in seeing a ton of. I was here in 1998.
Right.
Okay.
And I have a ton of stuff from that meeting. That's exactly the sort of people that could be very influential.
Yeah. And so, as I mentioned, in terms of the volume that'll come out of here, this is a volume aimed at the Whitehead community. So this is a different kind of thing, right?
I understand that.
This is not for a general audience, although it's important to do that too. It's important to not do the mistake that Jason's mentioning, which is to be insular. I don't mean it that way. What I mean is we need to encourage ourselves to engage with the work and figure out what its significance is, in part by linking it to what else was going on at the time and other areas. But it's very focused on the academic community, not trying to translate or to speak in language that would be intelligible to non-experts.
Thank you. I might use the word process even more than I use the word Whitehead because it's a little less contentious, maybe. I don't know, but that's what I want to learn. I want to.
Dr. Klein, I'd like to mention that this could be good for you and for the Whitehead community, but I think this sounds like the conference that the big national organizations would be interested in funding. I think the best way to get a community going is to have a call for papers, fund people to fly in, but there's lots of scientists who have these kind of interests, and I know some of them, but I think a call for papers will cover your cost to fly in. Suddenly, if the scientists are talking about it, then the Whitehead Project can turn to the NEH and say, look, this is important to science, and then it helps everybody's funding out.
More importantly, the NSF, who actually has money, as opposed to the NEH, which has no money or may not exist soon. So, That is a lot of the things. I have a sort of a question about the second volume that I was considering bringing up for us to chew on for a minute, if there wasn't any other.
Yeah, I would like to use the opportunity to emphasize a bit more what Helmut was saying right now. So he mentioned our website, ESPTeu, which stands for European Society for Process Thought. This is the entity that tries to provide a network of communication between European Whitehead scholars. So it's something that most US Americans probably would not fall into. But ESPT is also the shortcut for a book series we have as well, the European Studies in Process Thought. Now it's a bit unfortunate that it's the same acronym, but...
No, it was planned, it was not unfortunate.
No, it wasn't.
I planned it, come on.
Yeah, it was So, while we, on the one hand, we organize summer schools, and the next one, that's just the thing we talked about, we also have a book series that's actually running quite well right now. And this book series is not tied to specifically summer school proceedings or European Whitehead scholarship, but it's really rather open. And we have a contract with Cambridge Scholars that leads to affordable volumes, and I think that's a factor as well in academia. So it's not $200 per volume; it's really much less. So if you ever have the idea that you have something that is specifically, it doesn't even have to be a Whitehead, but it can be in the broader sense process philosophy, you might just contact Helmut or me and just give an idea of what you're working on, and we might see whether it would fit into the series as well. So we're just saying that because in recent years we had rather good success with publishing some volumes, and I think Cambridge Scholars would be interested in continuing sort of putting out volumes as well. So there might be an opportunity if you run up against problems otherwise. It's just.
And maybe I just should add, if you look at the webpage, you can see as well, we are not exclusive. I mean, being an American or something does not mean you could not be a member of the European Society as well. It's actually stated for people who are interested in process thought and not with a German or European passport or non-British passport. So anybody who wants to join in is welcome as well as a bit. I mean, we have individual members and legal members. So like the Metaphysical Society of Poland is a member of the European Society, and then we have individual members as well, like XYZ or myself. So.
Stan, if I may say, there are, the history of Whitehead in this country, after Whitehead passed away, predominantly been carried on by theologians, schools of theology. In China, I was involved in initiating the China project. I lectured there. I thought of it more for science, but it got diverted to be mostly ecology and social issues, which became more difficult as China's become more polarized and so on. But in Europe, they're not just scholars in philosophy, but there are some friends of mine, chemists, physicists, who are interested in Whitehead. So we have groups, and I'll share some of my work in that and introduce you. And we want to bring those into a broader network. But it's not just in the school of Whiteheadian philosophers or theologians. There are people in physics, mathematics. It's just being published Mereology, a handbook of Mereology, which is the extension of Whitehead's method of extensive abstraction. And my Professor Leonard, who was Whitehead's assistant, he's regarded as the father of that. Most American mathematicians don't even know about Mereology. It's a huge.
Yeah, I should also mention, I think this came up yesterday, Stan, but in philosophy of biology, Whitehead's, or at least process thought, is being proposed by John Dupre at Exeter as a new approach to philosophy of biology, and he's coming out with another volume on process biology. Although he's frustratingly ignorant of Whitehead's work, and criticizes it in his introduction, it still nevertheless provides an important avenue for philosophers and philosophers of science and theoretical biologists to take process thought seriously. So it's still, on the whole, it's still progress in the right direction, even if, unfortunately, he's hanging on to some old criticisms. So that would be another group of scientists and philosophers of science in the biology area. And the nice thing about this volume is, I think Whitehead's right that, who was it that was saying, this biology is going to be the, was it Alyosha or Dennis was saying, quoting the biology, who was the quote from, that biology is going to be the science of the future, going to swallow Haldane? Yeah, one of the younger, prescient, I think, in a lot of interesting sort of ways, but this fight's working its way out in sciences too. So one thing I wanted to, since we have a little bit of time, to get your opinion on the struggle that Joe and George and I are having with the second volume, concerns the 2-year period, right? We're looking at a 2-year period with up to 9 note takers. So this was a 1-year period with 3 note takers. We're looking at a 2-year period with 9 note takers. And one of the challenges we're having is that the note takers, we don't have a bell. We don't have a Winthrop bell in this second set. And what I mean by that is we don't have somebody who was taking nearly stenographic recording of what was going on, and it doesn't have regular dating. So one question I had for you was this. I was thinking about this with Joe last night over dinner. Our approach has been to sort of say, how do we try and manipulate those works into a shape that looks like this volume? Meaning lectures laid out in a dated order, the dates at the top, lecture 21, October 31st, whatever, because the dates are frequently not in the notes. Joe's got a good approach to try and triangulate on it, but it still requires a very educated guess of assigning a date. And then the more I thought about it last night, I thought, well, what if this next set of notes was the first volume we were doing? What if 25/7, we didn't have this, well, all we had was this new set of materials, we're taking it fresh, how would we approach coming at it? And so imagine, what would it be like if you had this and you had like semester 1, and you had a flow of notes, and dates appear sometimes when they appear, but there's no attempt to put onto it the structure that we've got here because it doesn't exist. Would that be, in some ways that's more conservative, but it's also it's very different than this. So initial reactions to that idea, does that seem?
Brian, it seems to me if you don't have clear dates, there's no need to feel compelled to force them. I mean, I think
it's not, once you've got the year established, I can't think of any clear reason for wanting to know anything more than the sequence of
of the way the
material.
lectures were.
I really don't care when it started or when it ended. I mean, unless it were turned up that in April the lectures are on something that then correlates with an elsewhere. But these are self-contained enough that their internal integrity is really all that's needed.
We'd still be able to make the cross-references that Paul and Jason do between Emerson and Radcliffe. Joe's already done a nice analysis saying, like Paul did, which it takes a lot of work to say, this looks like it correlates with the material that is here in Radcliffe. So we'd still be able to make those cross-references. But it wouldn't be Paul was able to do it by saying, the notes on 3rd of October at Emerson correlate to, and he'd be able to refer to the lecture number and the date. We won't probably frequently have that luxury, but other than that,
none of these note takers are a dominant enough presence.
In the third year, Whitehead's third year, there's a good source text, George Conger, PhD from Columbia, who was taking his junior sabbatical from University of Minnesota, spent a year with Whitehead at Harvard, and took all of his classes, took a good diary, and he's not as good as Bell, but he's very good in the third year. The second year, we have nobody Roethlisberger is our best choice, but he's Yeah, so there's not a great source text for the Whitehead second year.
Because I was thinking there was a way in which you could take one primary note-taking and then have what additional or deviant readings on it.
Well, that's a good
So
second question.
You're
Do you-
using snippets from the other people, since most of what they're saying is no improvement over what you've got in one key text.
And Joe might want to, and George can jump in on this. That's the second point that I wanted to bring up, so I'm glad you did. And that is this question about snippets, or how did you put it, Joe, that it's intersplicing, or let's say we've got a source text that's better than some of the others, but then every now and then one of the hartshorn's better just right here. And do we cut it in? Do we put it in a footnote?
It gets very messy very quickly, of course. But there are some clear cases when, oh gee, we're going to use Roethlisberger while he was absent this day. We have hartshorn notes. Maybe let's just.
That's easy enough. But let's say it's not that. Let's say it's that you can tell the content's lining up. You can tell they're in class of the same day, even though it's not dated. But there's a part of this one that's better than that one. What to do with that? And that's we're just going to have to figure this out. But I'm really worried about just intersplicing it. With footnotes. That's just right now has me a little bit nervous.
I didn't mean footnotes, I meant intersplicing.
I'm worried about the intersplicing. I mean noting where the splicing starts and stops, because you have to do that. But you don't have a hesitation that the intersplicing is problematic?
And that's you're identifying, you're using these notes at this point, and other person's notes at another.
What do other people think of this? This is a hard question.
But George, I remember agreeing with George. Can you even use horizontal little lines to demarcate? Okay, I'm with this person's notes, but this section is from a different person. But if it's thematically relevant or chronologically relevant in terms of the sequence.
Because the benefit of Paul's volume is that you've got all of Whitehead and all of Hawking, and then Heath, but they've got them one after the other.
Right.
And you read them one after the other, which is really helpful, right? Because Hawking imposes his outline, and he's between the two of them you get it, right? But this would be a very different approach, wouldn't it? It would be just giving one, and then every now and then giving a little bit of the other one, as opposed to just giving all of Roethlisberger, all of Hartshorn.
Right.
Which would be another approach entirely.
If you stuck with the first volume's model.
Yeah.
Right.
Brian, can I jump in with the idea of using Turnitin.com as a scholarly resource? So you can upload each of these lectures as if they were like a student paper you're receiving, and then Turnitin.com.
Originality score.
That's right, and you can kind of figure out like which one has the most overlap, which one has the least overlap.
That's very clever.
But they highlight it for you.
They do, yeah. No, I take your point. That's really a clever use of their algorithms to do work for you. That's fascinating. That's in fact, because you get a quantitative score of the relationship between Roethlisberger's notes and Hartshorn's notes. That would be. I have no idea what it would come up with, but I'm kind of fascinated just to see how it would chew on that, if it would find anything at all.
If the concern is things being left out, maybe that's not one of the concerns.
It is.
Is it possible to have an online archive?
So this is what Jude asked last night, and the answer to the question is it depends on which work we're talking about. With Hartshorn, since you own the rights to those, that's easy enough. But with others, we don't own the artifacts, and we can't even get permission to do digitals of the artifacts. And so all we could do is potentially the transcript of the original. We may be able to do if the note taker's been long since dead.
Is that true? Even if it's sort of maybe password protected under library use?
Yeah, because we would be we can use it for personal use only. And that's so even putting it behind a paywall or a password wall would still, I think, be going farther than the library. We've certified each time we get them. We will not do that.
So a legal question here. So if somebody goes and records Britney Spears in concert, they don't own that. Britney Spears owns that. So if they're recording Whitehead's lectures, isn't that Whitehead's copyright?
No, it's your note takers.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Turns
Heath,
out that-
Heath owns the copyright to her notes, not Whitehead.
It'd be more like if you recorded yourself singing Britney Spears.
George, did you want to jump in on this question of it? I was just curious. You look like you were.
No.
No. Okay, Joe.
Happy to listen.
Did you want? I thought you had also wanted to jump in. No.
Oh, well, I was just, Bill was talking about a very practical concern. If we do start intercutting these things, how do you actually identify quickly and easily, well, this is Roethlisberger versus Hartshorn, for instance? And that's not necessarily an easy question. Like, in some ways, it would be great if we could do like multiple colors of the text, but that's obviously not a practical solution. No one's going to print.
Online you could, but not
online.
not in print.
I mean, I was mentioning this to someone either this morning or last night, that maybe it's not so hard to see why some publishers are not into doing physical editions of these things anymore. Because you have unlimited real estate all of a sudden and can lay out all these different versions. And
George mentioned this last night, and it's both a curse and a blessing that we've decided to go this route. And part of it was my desire to have handsome volumes on shelves.
Yeah.
You know, and I think pulp is not yet dead. But other projects are exclusively electronic. And the interesting thing about them, and I'd be curious to get Jason's comment on this if he agrees, but my experience with them is that they're flat, and that the materials can be organized in all sorts of different ways, but in a way, every piece is a piece, and it's like a little monad, and they're all on the same level, so to speak. And you can enforce editorial frameworks, but the nice thing about this is, in a way, to build on something George said on the first day, I think, is that we're trying to do some work for you, to present you with something that, we're doing the work of sort of, that means selections and choices and decisions, but then that means it's created into an editorial unit that's supposed to be useful, instead of just wading through thousands and thousands of pages, even though you get cool, pages next to each other, which is another tool I'd love to have, because it's a useful tool for me to use, but we wanted to create intellectual units. Maybe that's a mistake. I don't know. It's just sort of the approach.
Now I'll say something. I think the difficulty of this problem depends upon the lens through which you're looking at the end product. If you're looking at that volume as being a volume of Whitehead's lectures in 1925-26, you, in a sense, a person doesn't give a rat's ass whether it's Roethlisberger or Hartshorn or this or that. They would like to see a continuous transcript of what Whitehead said. Our work is to make that possible. How do we make that possible? While remaining inside the gut. Well, we have to have permission to use the sources we use. But if we start getting worried about separating Roethlisberger from Hartshorn, from Conger, from whatever, then it's like we've shifted emphasis from Whitehead to them. And now we're creating some major difficulties because in terms of authenticity and accuracy and whatever, we realize their styles are different and there are gaps and so forth. But imagine we just took the note takers' names off. Just took them off. And we had these transcripts. The only question we would have before us was the one George focused on. What's the sequence? What follows what? That's hard enough, okay? But we don't color code when we use something from one or the other because it's Whitehead. It's not Roethlisberger. Well, it is Roethlisberger, but it's Roethlisberger trying to record Whitehead and doing the best he can. So the notes will read better and worse, as they do in this case. But maybe the mistake was to keep Hawking. Yeah. Except that Hawking is Hawking and he really added something. But in general, we've got kids taking notes, doing the best they can. And what we want is the beginning lecture, followed by the second lecture, followed by the third, and who took which piece of it. I wouldn't care at all unless you raised that issue for me and problematized it. And that's another way in which editing this kind of thing is very different than documentary editing, where I deeply care. I'm doing Dorothy Sayers' diary, you know. I need to be very, very accurate and literal and positivistic about that. But here, what I'm trying to be accurate and literal, positivistic about is what Whitehead said. And I've got various versions of it, and sometimes no version of it. And so I'm putting together the best version I can. And you say that up front, and you have the source materials available for people to look at or to locate if they need to know that for some scholarly reason. But most people are going to want to know what Whitehead said. And I just keep coming up against this as though we're introducing a level of archival precision into what we're trying to do that is getting in our way rather than helping us.
Well, in principle, George, I want to second you, but obviously this nice possibility of having for the same lecture, which I just used 2 quotes on aesthetics, by Bell and by Hawking, is of course a neat way of making sure that you get something from Whitehead and not from XYZ. But if that is not possible, it's not possible. I mean, I would think as well it's as simple as that. So,
but Helmut, if you had wanted to do that and you did it, and that was nice and it was possible because of the volume, but imagine that was your problem, you weren't sure, you would look at them and you would decide what was.
Yeah,
and that the reader of your article would just see what Whitehead said. They wouldn't know whether it was Bell who took the notes or Hart. See?
No, but I'm saying, if you can't do it, then I would think as well the only way out is taking one series of notes and the other, which has a disadvantage compared to the first volume. Yeah. But for certain reasons, if you can't do it, you can't do it.
But would you go so far as to follow George in saying just don't reflect the author, the note taker? That seems.
No, of course not. I was deliberately being radical there, just trying to get you to think about what we're trying to do.
If you do it like that. No, of course, you would have to add.
Because when I'm reading the Bell and the Hawking, I find only with the combination and Heath, only with the combination do I actually feel like I'm getting a sense as to what he was saying frequently. So, but that's not to contradict George's point necessarily. It's just simply, I think if we're going to say this is a critical edition, it raises the standard of obligation, even if George is not wrong that. As I said in the first day, we're going to use a different standard and approach for the correspondence when we're actually working on Whitehead's letters that he actually wrote. We will use a even higher level of editorial standard than we are now. I'm just uncomfortable with how far George is willing to go and in the other direction. So maybe
So you don't want a transcript of what Whitehead, as close as possible, said in his lectures, continuously, thematically, day to day, week to week, for 1925-26.
I feel like we have an obligation to be clear to the reader when and who's taking the notes and where that starts and stops.
And the introduction would say this transcript is derived from notes taken by the following.
These 3 people.
Yes, these 3 people in that year. The transcript has been created.
But you would have no way of knowing, who was taking what notes and when. And
right. I wouldn't. As I'm reading along, I'm just assuming Whitehead speaking, but sometimes I'm getting Whitehead as recorded by Roethlisberger another time, and I might or might not care about that. I would think very few people would, but those who did would be able to then do for themselves.
It seems ironic for you to say this, though, George, because you are the one defending the idea that these were primary source texts. And if they're primary source texts, we should treat them as primary source texts, not created.
It's Whitehead that's the primary source text.
But you're only getting that in the triangulation, which requires laying them all out.
Right.
Independently.
But again, I say I'm after Whitehead. If I took recording cylinders that I had, the Edison cylinders, I wouldn't even have any way of noting where the stuff came from. I would only be able to write down the transcript the best I could do by collating the cylinders the way we're doing. There would be and I'd say the cylinders were recovered from a certain archive and so forth.
So Alyosha and then Paul.
Yeah, so I think I'm sort of sympathetic to your viewpoint, but I think we shouldn't make this into a discussion of principle at that point. But we should use the opportunity with every volume to sort of start with a slate and see how it works out. So the biggest difference I see between the first and the second volume is that you have 3 note takers in the first one, and you can do parallel lectures for 3 people, no problem. And then you have a much larger number for the second volume. And things that are so feasible that we don't even talk about, that we just assume, we just see it works, become unfeasible just by practice.
Right.
So I think, and the next volumes will be different as well, and everything will have its own problems. So I think we should allow for a certain freedom or a certain liberty of choice of each editing team. But also, I think what's important is that I would say the stuff has to be coherent in every volume.
Exactly.
So, for example, you have a number of lectures that don't have dates in between, and sometimes you cannot say with certainty this where one lecture stops and the next one starts, and things get muddled. In that case, that seems to be a good, or that would seem to be a good argument for deciding against labeling the other the other transcripts according to lecture 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. as well. So you have a coherent format. Exactly. One thing I also think is good from my perspective is what you just said, that and that's the way I approach the first volume, is it gives you a very good tool to triangulate what Whitehead might have said. In a sense, and I mean, now it sort of steps over to philosophy, but when Kant decided to do his philosophical system, he would always say, I would love to talk about reality as such, but the way I see it, that's not the point. The only thing we can do as human beings is to talk about the categories of reason that lead us to interpret reality. And so this distancing step has led to a new development in philosophy. And by this very strange metaphor, I would say, if we all agree that we want to get at Whitehead, ultimately want to get at Whitehead, but we somehow come up against a situation in which we say, well, we couldn't justify calling what we are doing getting to Whitehead directly. We take one distancing step and just provide material, so in order that everybody might triangulate for him or herself what the most probable or the most plausible Whitehead lecture might have been, then that might be sort of a sign of progress as well. So I think the arguments, the arguments are there, and every team has to decide for him or herself or for themselves what to do.
Paul and then Phipps.
I'd like to comment on 2 things that have come up. So give me a chance to get to 2 before.
Well, I guess I couldn't stop if I tried.
Okay, first of all, I think there's a consideration here that's probably apparent to everybody, but certainly isn't being spoken. One worry is if we go all the way to just make them into as close to a singular script as possible, which I find very attractive, that we'll lose. Will throw away something you're responsible for. And of course, that's not going to happen. It's always going to be possible to recover these individual sources, and even George's conscience is not going to let him get away without saying.
Yeah, I'm not going to destroy the manuscripts after I'm done. They're still there.
Well, you're going to ask somebody to burn them, right? So
yes, that's right.
That's why we have this one. So that seems to me that alternative shouldn't be throwing you too far into scholarly responsibility here, because the focus has got to be on the guy giving the lecture that was given by that guy. it does seem to me, and I've said this before, but it bears repeating in the content, I think, in what you're saying now, is we had it easy with the first volume. They triangulate because they're so different. And they're not just different idiosyncratically and personality-wise, which is also true. The one's a senior professor, one's a graduate student, then there's whatever Winthrop Bell is, which it doesn't seem to be repeatable. The sort of things that I've watched over your shoulder and heard Joe talking about are, you're down to the idiosyncrasies between kids.
Yeah.
And that's the least important thing.
That is the least important thing. Absolutely.
So that, if somebody really cares about that, they're going to be able to go where you've gone and recover that. Scholars can do that sort of thing.
Roethlisberger's grandson.
Exactly.
Yeah, but nobody else will.
But so it seems to me the editorial judgment that has to be exacted here is when do we get past mere idiosyncrasy that just gets in the way and get to differences that are significant enough that really generate triangulation.
And then how to reflect that.
And I don't personally, I'm the wrong guy to ask, but I don't think we made the wrong guess in volume 1. It seemed to me the differences between those three sources, we only had 3, was sufficient that it accomplishes this job quite nicely. You can either go past it or you can dwell on it if you want in the volume, I think.
And there may be a future volume where you have something like that, but right
that's
now
not
we don't.
what you're looking at
That's
here.
not what we're looking at.
You got to your second point, right?
Yeah, no, my second point.
Oh, shoot.
My second point goes back to the earlier comments that came out about not really needing to know what day this was.
Say that again?
But not needing
The
to know the
dating
date,
the
that's-
lectures,
that's-
if it's
that's-
difficult, as I think
Yeah.
you said,
Yeah.
if after all it's becoming superhuman, only Joe can figure out exactly what date this might have been with footnoted caveats, then don't bother me with that. I mean, I tend to agree with you when I'm so I'm thinking back, why were we so fixed? Partly it was available, but why were we so fixed on making sure they're indexed, to use that term loosely, they're numbered or they're dated or both?
Right. And you even kept separate files. Each lecture was in a separate file.
Yeah, everyone in a different file.
More concrete.
Clearly one of the reasons was, and I hope this isn't just idiosyncratic to me, I don't think so, and I think it preserves, George, what you're wanting to keep our attention on, namely Whitehead doing these lectures. We're interested in them because we're watching the guy think through these things vis-a-vis the published stuff we already know about. So the dates become important when process and reality is being formulated.
Right.
Insofar as you can know that. So in our case, we knew that Science in the Modern World is published the same year, at the end of, in the fall of 25. Of course, they come out of the Lowells, so when do the Lowells happen? Well, the Lowells happen in February. Well, now it starts to become interesting. I would have thought for almost anybody, is this a lecture that's happening before February or after February? Or what's he doing during February?
Right.
Well, it turns out he does easy stuff. He teaches them baby logic so he can save all of his energy for the evening, the late afternoon.
I've never done that before.
Yeah, so I mean, what I'm trying to capture here is the dating. I was pretty keen to build into the volume insofar as we could.
Right.
Really wasn't motivated by knowing exactly when October ended and November began. But where are you in the where are you in the semester? How does that relate to externals that matter here, namely when the Giffords are being composed, or when, eventually when Adventure of Ideas is being thought about? There's some of those kind of, you're going to need anchor points. You're going to need some way to kind of gauge the before and afters there. And the editors are going to need to be thinking about, if we don't have a very careful system, how much of that do we want to try to create and provide? Or how much can we just back out and say, you're on your own, it goes for a semester?
Thanks, Paul. It was really, really helpful. Phipps and then Bill.
Well, just briefly, I think what George is saying, if I read you right, we don't want a scholastic type of exercise that is pedantic in its nature.
This is by definition that.
If I read what George is saying, the deeper aim is the heuristic purpose. That is, the purpose is to shed illumination on Whitehead's thought. And that should be the guiding principle, not some scholastic thing that can be buried in archives that no one's going to read and no one has get illumination. So I think you have to bear in mind the heuristic value of illuminating Whitehead's thought rather than recording the historic note-taking of this student and that student and that.
That's so important, but just as a response, you have an obligation to your reader to be really clear how and when and why you're making editorial decisions. This isn't against what George is saying, it's just simply the scholastic apparatus is the way that the reader has confidence in that they're getting at Whitehead and not what the editor has done with and to the text, silently.
Yeah, I'm not contradicting that. I think it can be presented so that the historical context and the sources of the raw material are cited and described, because historic context is very vital to understanding things.
We might compare our,
It's not, didn't finish it.
sorry.
No, you did.
Oh, that's the difference between a kind of pedantic versus a heuristic approach whose fundamental aim is to use these treasures, and include Whitehead's letters and other things, to use these treasures to illuminate Whitehead's thought. And if the editorial process diverts from that fundamental mission, it will be effete rather than potent. Is that something wrong?
I just have
No, I
a
think
couple
that's-
distinct thoughts. One is I agree that the reason why the reader is excited to read it is to try to get at what Whitehead was saying. I realize that you want to do it in a critical way, and that's Paul's point. I would say use dates when you have them, but don't feel compelled to invent them, construct them when you're not confident. Brian, I take it that the challenge here is with 9 note takers. Sometimes you have duplicate discussions of I'll call it a paragraph. Is that and you don't want to put 9 paragraphs of this Whitehead saying basically the same thing. Is that part of the problem? And then sometimes,
Yeah, sure. That's
that part of
one
the problem?
of about 100 different interpolate, like like permutations of what might, or like more likely a block of we have a date here and a date there, and so we have a block of 10 pages, and that we have dates for, and then we do and then we just do those, and then we do another bit from another person, or we just run the whole thing of all of Roethlisberger for the whole semester, and then the whole of Hartshorne for the whole semester. There's all these different versions of it, and so we can't do all 9. We know we can't do that, so luckily we have to make hard decisions.
so back to George. So to the best of your ability, so you can pretty well, am I hearing you correctly? You can pretty well track thematically where they seem to be.
But not so much in like paragraphs. Yeah, I mean you can see that the content's similar enough, but where to exactly start and stop it will be tricky. But yeah, you can say keywords pop up that makes you confident that that's the same day, at the same time, even though there's no date designation.
Yeah, I mean I was thinking in terms of sourcing. As a reader, if you used discrete footnotes, as in letters, H for Hartshorne at the end of a Hartshorne section or paragraph, I don't know how,
Right.
the letters for each of the 9 sources, and then demarcate perhaps by a space where where the thematic flow is related.
I kind of like that version, but one way of even making this even more intractable for me is imagine we also have 2 people, Hartshorne and Roethlisberger, sitting in Emerson Hall at the same time writing things down, and then we've got Radcliffe. And just on the analysis where we can see when he's lecturing, and Paul did the same thing, we can see that his lectures, although they're not always on the same day at the same time, the content is the same. He's not delivering different material at Radcliffe.
Right.
And so in one version of what we're all discussing here, it could be just to forget about the fact that sometimes it's in Emerson,
Right.
sometimes in Radcliffe, and have it all together. Have it all together, because if we go on George's principle, we're trying to get at what that lecture said, even though we delivered it twice. In different locations, we say this seems to be what he's saying in this lecture, even though it's physically and temporally in two different times, two different places. That we could go that route, but that would be super different than
Could
than
you-
what we.
Could you do a Harvard a Harvard work through and a Radcliffe work through
Could,
in
that's-
this volume like you did in volume one,
Yep.
but obviously
Yep.
with these modifications?
We don't
Yep.
have second semester, right?
Just the
Yeah.
first semester Radcliffe in 25, and nothing in 26-7, but we could.
So let me speak in praise of my former employers, the Husserl Archive. So their model, which is successful, is a beautiful, readable text, and then this horrible Scholastic, tell me if this is German, Textkritischer Anhang.
Exactly.
So that's the Scholastic stuff you get at the very end for the people who care about it. So you explain everything, and you can do it very briefly. We used H for this paragraph is a combination of H, R, G, and you find succinct ways to put these things, but the readable text itself is so, an undergraduate who's reading wants to know about Husserl and time consciousness, I think it's how to read it. But you also want the serious Husserl scholars to know, oh, this is the Bernauer manuscript or whatever, and they would get that in the Textkritischer Anhang.
Yep, that would be another route to go. Yeah, similar to what version of the critical edition the corrected edition for PR. They did a similar sort of thing, not quite as detailed as the Husserl folks. And that would be a way to do it too, where you wouldn't be even needing to have braces or other intrusions into the text. That moves us closer to a clear text and away from the diplomatic. And so it would be a different approach, but one that would retain. What the nice thing is, it would retain the content in the volume. You don't have to go to an archive in California physically to get the information. So that's an interesting idea too.
May I do it?
I did. I'm sorry, George. George Allen, and then other George.
Whitehead has
Sorry.
taught us in the book that simplification is necessary to get any kind of intelligibility, right? And you got too much. Triangles can't have 9 sides. It's just ridiculous. So that you start with the virtue of needing to eliminate it out of the material.
Yeah.
But I don't know why you couldn't triangulate with one fairly good thing and then snippets going along with it where they from the other people where they vary. And there's all sorts of devices. You don't have to use color or font change or location in space, indentations and whatnot. I've seen all of those.
What's exciting to me about this
To mark the
conversation
difference.
is that you all are very much more open to this than I expected you to be. I expected the Germans to be rioting over here, to be perfectly honest.
I'm trying to get at.
I really.
What George is saying is, when you look, George, the other George was talking about the theological research done on the Gospels. To get a proper comparison of the Gospel took them 2 to 3 generations. So, as brilliant as it could be if they could do it, and they were basically focusing, of course, life and teaching of Jesus, it would create tremendous difficulties. Like, for example, you have similar passages which would fit for the lecture October 3rd, December 14th, in January. So what do? We repeat them each time. Or since we quoted it once, we'll leave it out and everybody could see it. So there, of course, the kritischer Textapparat is exactly the way you should do it, because it would serve both purposes, and it comes back to you as well.
Yeah.
You want to get as close to what Whitehead was saying. At the same time, you have the liberty for everybody to have his own mind of, this is taken from there, this is taken from there, maybe it should be interpreted differently. That's exactly the golden way, I would say, the golden means of dealing with the problem.
I jumped over you, George.
Yeah.
Did you want to get back in?
Yeah, I just had a little, if it's okay.
And Alyosha, yeah.
That I wanted to defend Brian's concern simply that the thing that we fear creating inadvertently or deliberately, even worse if it were malicious, is what Lewis did in the back of his emergence with Hawking's notes. We thought, all of us, I mean, it was just generally assumed, and Lowe repeated what turned out to be an inaccurate statement, that the Hawking notes had been reproduced and transcribed in their entirety in Ford's, an appendix to Ford. And it turned out when Paul and I got all of those notes, some were missing, we realized most were summaries, and the summaries were tendentious. That is, if you looked at the lecture that we finally had, of which Jennifer Vanderlift had prepared at Lewis's behest, and Lewis had approved a summary of the lecture for publication. Some of those summaries neglected a lot of material that was actually in the lecture that contradicted the sort of argument that Lewis was constructing in the forefront of the book out of that appendix. That would be the bad version, right? That's and I asked Lewis, I talked to him about this, and we discovered this. What were you doing? What was, and he told me as best he was able to why they did what they did and how they published it that way. That was a decision that was up to them to make, and they made it. But it wasn't clear, and it wasn't accurate.
Well, and George, it was fraud, to be frank.
Well,
if you look at the text, as we were saying.
Yeah. I hesitate, even I, the mean-spirited, because the first copy of my, I had 2 copies of this. I gave the first one to Lewis because I know he couldn't get it any other way, and the second one I gave to George Whitehead. Brian and I presented to him. I admired Lewis very much, and I don't want to. His project rested. Fraud, it was being too driven by his prejudices or his own archetype somehow.
He's trying to make an argument. You guys aren't trying to make any argument.
Well,
we're trying to be faithful.
We're trying to right. We're just simply trying to be faithful without being slavish, and right, and how to balance these things, and it's forcing us to make difficult decisions. We have lunch waiting for us. I just wanted to thank you again. I'm really glad that I asked this question because it really has made it clear that the community's willing to allow us to sort of make these difficult decisions and would prefer that we do so rather than try to be really slavishly particular. And so that's heartening to me. And I hope for your volume too, that you can take it and make difficult decisions to make the best possible product that we can achieve given the space and time we have.
We take 2 more minutes to hear what Paul has to say.
2 short comments. One is,
Well, we're over into lunch. So,
Lunch will not go.
Lunch will wait.
Okay.
what
Lunch will
about
wait?
numbering?
All right. So I
It's
just
settled.
I just wanted to make a very short addendum to this textkritischer Anhang, which is a very, very German phrase in by itself, but it has one virtue that might or might not appeal to you, but what it does, it allows the reader to choose his own mode of gradation. So you can be very succinct and very detailed, but you can also get the strategic picture, and that might sort of chime into some things we've discussed today. So just as an addendum.
And 2 comments. One is, I was somewhat amused finding the volumes being numbered in the stuff you distributed. So I'm thinking,
We just can't give it up.
Is that protension of what is going to happen? Because we are very much in favor of it. But secondly, I think one should take the opportunity to kind of semi-officially thank Joseph, Joe, and Ryan for making the whole thing work.
Really, Joe. Thank you, everybody. Looks like we've got some lunch in the back, but perfect timing.